And I sometimes wonder if my own emotions interfered, but from my perspective, it seemed like the prosecution did as much, if not more, of, not just that, but some other different things that were super questionable. And I always felt like there was more pressure on the defense for those actions. But again, I don't know. I like that other side viewpoint you have, because again, I don't want to be emotional when I'm thinking about that. It just seemed like that to me.
Right. Well, I'll tell you what, we have to remember in death penalty cases, there is a huge amount of lawyering that goes on before the trial starts. And I think what you saw in the trial was the result of, Judge Perry came a little late in the game, so he had the case, maybe a year before it went to trial. So he heard all the pretrial hearings, and what had happened before was there was a pattern of these type of violations on the part of the defense and not so much on the prosecution. And so by the time he got to trial, unfortunately, Baez had already established himself in Judge Perry's eyes as not being on the up and up and not being forthright and consistently engaging in behavior that he thought was intentionally misleading.
That makes sense.
By the time we all tuned in and got to trial, yes, the prosecution did one or two times get clipped because Judge Perry actually said one time, "You're both playing games with me. Neither one of you is listening." And this is when Baez and Jeff Ashton were up, and they were arguing a point. And, he finally said to the two of them, if you'll remember this day, he said, look at the clock on the back wall. Tell me what time
I remember. Yep,
I remember
Baez
that. Something like 9:14, and Ashton goes, it's 9:15. And the judge goes, see that? You will never agree on anything, and I'm sick of the game. And you see the clobbers both sides. But I think the frustration with Jose was, I don't think that the judge ever thought the prosecution was intentionally hiding the ball or violating, but I think based on Jose's behavior leading up to and all of the prior problems that they'd had with him, I think by the time we saw it, televised in the course of the trial, the judge was just fed up and he had enough.
And
I think is a result.
From the outside looking in, because I was totally neutral and I let the trial, lead me, and I saw Ashton being a much older, much more experienced prosecutor, and his personal style that he has, which has been really successful for him, and he has that super assertive, presence, and Baez 3 years out, young, which he did really, really good, and he had a great style too in lots of ways, but I think that as a prosecutor, from what my research showed, it seemed like there were times in the past that he's gotten in trouble for doing different things, Ashton has, and I just thought maybe he did a really good job too of kind of getting it all done better because he's more experienced as far as all the different games they play.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt when you look at Jose Baez's 3 years versus Ashton's 30 years, who's got the upper hand as far as experience. But remember, too, now, Cheney Mason was on Baez's team, and Cheney Mason is the best of the best. He was voted like the top 100 lawyers in Miami or Orlando, whatever that area is.
Indeed,
he was one of the top lawyers in the country.
Indeed.
So, Baez had the opportunity to let Cheney play a much bigger role, and he didn't. I think Baez got a little swept up, like a lot of younger people do in fame and fortune.
Sure.
We see with young singers and rock stars, and they get all starry-eyed in the spotlight, and they start playing to the camera as opposed to really focusing on the details of a court proceeding. So I think what happened with him was he would have been better served in some instances to let Cheney Mason do more of the presentation.
I thought so too.
In the long run, let's face it, it worked. I mean, I don't think that Baez is a good lawyer as far as the law and legalistically, but I will say this for him, and I'm not a fan, but I'll give credit where credit is due. He's a fantastic presenter. He's a very good oralist. So when he stood up and he gave that, bang-up opening, we all sat out and paid attention.
I know.
And he can deliver a line, let me tell you something, Now, I don't admire his lawyering, but I will say his presentation was great. I think, because he got caught up in that and didn't listen to Cheney a lot, those of us who know the law and know the procedure of the court, we can understand where Judge Perry was coming from, because I'll tell you something, it is much harder to try a case against an inexperienced lawyer than it is against an experienced lawyer. And people wouldn't think that. They would think, oh, you don't want somebody who's going to give you a fight. You don't want a real bulldog on the other side.
It makes sense, though.
Yes, you do. You absolutely do.
It's like being defending themselves. That's your worst nightmare, because then it's even 10 times harder for you. It's their right, but it actually makes everybody else's job harder.
That's exactly right. And bear in mind, too, when you've got a bad lawyer on the other side, you've got to protect the defendant's rights, even though you're the prosecutor, and that seems counterintuitive, because you don't want it coming back on appeal. You don't want the lawyer doing such a bad job that the defendant gets shafted in some legal mechanism, and then you've got to do it all over again. So it's difficult, but I understand completely where Ashton's attitude came from, because, again, by the time he got to trial with Jose Baez fumbling and messing stuff up, he had just had it. He had just absolutely had it. And that's where we saw a lot of, it was so clear that the problems between Baez and Ashton had just gotten personal by the time
it had. I also felt like Ashton had that syndrome that you see with a really successful maybe NFL team that's had a long winning run for even seasons in a row, and they're confident to the point that they're cocky and they make mistakes, and I saw a lot of that too, and I just thought that with a case such as it was, even without all of the high profile that it became, it was still a death penalty case, and it was critically important to get it right, and because of that. And so I like learning from this, because I think that it's really important for people to really get that, so that they understand that these things, this was her trial, but this stuff is going to affect everybody in the future. Like right now, they're talking about how the jury for the Marie Anthony case and the different fallout from that, it could potentially affect their decisions with this jury for Michael Jackson, from whether or not to sequester them to, could the jury pool be influenced, that kind of thing. So, it shows you how, even though it's completely different ends of the country, completely different case, people, and on, it correlates through all of us, because we're all Americans, it's all of our justice system, and all these cases set precedent for the others in the future.
Well, absolutely, and I think what happened here was the prosecution sort of missed the forest for the trees, if you will, in that, I watched the entire trial, and I did a lot of commenting on it, and I still believe they had the evidence that they needed for conviction. Where I think they fell down on the job was they assumed that the jury would get some of the legal concepts, and they didn't spend a lot of time explaining to a jury how you deliberate, what is, certain legal terms like reasonable doubt, circumstantial evidence, why it's reliable, giving examples of that. And I think you're right. I think they were so confident in their evidence because they've been doing this 30 years, and they're looking at it and going, yeah, this is sufficient. And, that's absolutely a trap that any litigator needs to be careful of. You don't want to go in there so confident that you forget to break down the basics and you forget to explain legal concepts to the jury. One of the things I do in a closing argument is the first thing I do is get up and I tell the jury, okay, I don't mean to be insulting, and you know what, you guys are from all different walks of life. You don't do this every day like I do, so let me give you a lesson in how to deliberate. This is what you're going to do when you go back, and I literally tell them, 3 things are going to play into it here. You're going to get your indictment out or your charging document. You're going to get out the law that the judge gives you, and then you're going to line up the evidence with it. This is what they need to prove. This is what an element of a crime is. There's a lot of questions that you might not have answers to, but that does not equal reasonable. And so I tell my jury, this is how you deliberate, this is what these terms mean, and P.S., this is what they don't mean. And I think we saw an absence of that, and so the jury got back there, and they were left wondering. They had all these questions, and the questions didn't go to the elements of the crime, but nobody told them you can still convict even if you have questions. And so I think that's exactly what happened. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said they got a little overconfident and they didn't break it down. They didn't authorize their jury to return a conviction, because there are a lot of unanswered questions in this case. And you're right, this will impact the system forever, because we're also looking at not just what happened with the jury, and now we're looking at laws that may come into effect that will, influence jurors in the future. Like, you can't, sell your story for any money for 6 months after the verdict. You can't X, Y, Z. And then we've got, on the flip side of that, we've got Kelly's laws being, which is a fabulous thing. We've got those things.
I like that because it's something that the supporters and the haters can almost all agree on. And I like seeing good things, come from something like this.
Absolutely.
And do you think that, I felt like the prosecution's evidence was weak in certain areas as it pertained to premeditation and therefore the death penalty. So I felt like it would have been, and even being a supporter, I have always said, and I feel that she definitely, and she even admitted, according to Jose Baez in his opening statement, if you go with that she was involved in, everything after her death. Well, there's a lot of crime involved in that. And it's concerning when, those are, here we are, people trying to, call her back to Orlando in the line of fire. It would be safer for her in jail if she was serving a sentence for some of the other definite crimes that occurred after the death that I think, had they done their testing and their forensics and stuff like that, those things would have probably produced more evidence. And not only, were those charges not sought out and added to but also then George Anthony too. To me, it was enough of a question left that he possibly could have been involved, and that even that they perhaps might have even looked a little bit at it a couple of times. But they had just this, I don't know, tunnel vision almost, or confidence that, hey, we got it right, let's go with this. I don't know how right I am, but I just think that it was overreach, and we have a lot of fallout now because of it. And now we've got them calling her back to Orlando, and online I'm seeing people literally like planning to kill her, and how much they want it to happen. And people write me every day and tell me this, like, what are we gonna do? I'm like, gather and get organized, and so on. But it's scary.